What if the French Revolution did not end with freedom? What if it ended with one man placing a crown on his own head? A man who was not born a king. A man who came from a small island. A man who rose through smoke, chaos, and war, until almost every throne in Europe had to ask the same terrifying question. How do you stop Napoleon? At the beginning, Europe thought the French Revolution was the danger. Kings feared the crowds. They feared the guillotine. They feared the idea that ordinary people could tear down an old monarchy and declare a new world. But then something even more frightening appeared. Not a mob, not a parliament, not a philosopher, a soldier. And this soldier understood something that the old kings did not. The revolution had destroyed the old order, but someone still had to decide what came next. Napoleon Bonaparte decided the answer would be him. In December 1804, inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the scene looked like something from the old world. Golden robes, religious ceremony, nobles watching, the Pope present. But this was not a normal coronation, because Napoleon was not simply receiving power from tradition. He was showing the world that power now belonged to the man who could take it. In that cathedral, the former revolutionary general became Emperor of the French, and the question became almost impossible to ignore. Did France overthrow kings just to create an emperor more powerful than all of them? For Europe's rulers, this was not just a French problem anymore. If Napoleon could crown himself in Paris, what could stop him from remaking Germany? What could stop him from crushing Austria? What could stop him from forcing Russia to negotiate? What could stop him from building a Europe where the old dynasties survived only if he allowed them to survive? The answer at first seemed simple. The kings would unite. Austria, Russia, Britain and others would form coalitions. They would combine their armies. They would use old power against this new emperor. And in 1805 they believed they had their chance. Napoleon was deep in Central Europe. The Austrians and Russians had gathered a huge force. They believed they could trap him. They believed the emperor had gone too far. But Napoleon was waiting for them to believe exactly that. The battlefield was near Austerlitz. It was cold. Mist covered the ground. 3 emperors were connected to this battle. Napoleon of France, Francis of Austria, Alexander of Russia. To the Allies, this looked like the moment when Europe would finally humble the French emperor. Napoleon allowed his enemies to see what he wanted them to see. A weak right side, a chance to attack, a possible French retreat. The Allied commanders looked at the field and believed they had found Napoleon's weakness. So they moved. They stretched their army toward the place where Napoleon seemed vulnerable. But that was the trap. Napoleon was not trying to protect every piece of ground. He was trying to control the enemy's imagination. He wanted them to move first. He wanted them to expose their center. He wanted them to think they were winning at the exact moment they were stepping into danger. Then the fog began to lift. The French struck the center. The Allied line was split. The army that had come to destroy Napoleon was suddenly the army being destroyed by him. Austerlitz became one of Napoleon's greatest victories, and its meaning was much bigger than one battlefield. The message traveled across Europe. The old powers had joined together, and Napoleon had beaten them, not slowly, not defensively, but with speed, calculation, and terrifying confidence. After Austerlitz, Europe understood that Napoleon was not just another general. He was a force that could make ancient kingdoms look fragile. But here is the mystery of Napoleon's empire. Every victory made him stronger, and every victory also made his problem bigger. Because winning a battle is not the same as ruling a continent. To defeat Austria was one thing. To keep Austria obedient was another. To beat Prussia was one thing. To reorganize Germany was another. To force treaties on kings was one thing. To make millions of people accept French control was another. Napoleon could defeat armies faster than anyone expected. But Europe was not just armies. Europe was ports, merchants, churches, borders, languages, loyalties, and memories. And above all, Europe had one enemy Napoleon could not easily reach: Britain. Britain was different. Napoleon could march across the continent, but he could not simply march across the English Channel. Britain had ships, Britain had money, Britain had trade. And as long as Britain survived, it could pay, encourage, and organize new coalitions against France. So Napoleon tried to defeat Britain without invading it. He tried to turn Europe into an economic cage. If British goods could not enter European ports, Britain would suffer. If Europe obeyed Napoleon's blockade, Britain would be isolated. This was the logic. But the plan created a new problem. To close Europe to Britain, Napoleon had to control Europe more tightly than ever before. Every coastline mattered. Every ally had to obey. Every ruler had to choose between Napoleon's commands and their own economy. And the more Napoleon tightened his grip, the more resistance he created. This is where the story changes. Because Napoleon's dream did not collapse in one moment. It began to crack in places that did not look like the center of power. One of those places was Spain. At first, Spain seemed like a piece on Napoleon's chessboard, a kingdom that could be pressured, a throne that could be replaced, a route to Portugal which was tied to Britain. Napoleon moved into the Iberian Peninsula and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. On paper, it looked like control, but Spain did not behave like a piece on a chessboard. Spain became a wound. The war there did not look like Napoleon's clean victories in Central Europe. It was not one dramatic trap on one battlefield. It was towns, mountains, roads, ambushes, sieges, anger, and resistance. Spanish and Portuguese fighters refused to make the war simple. British forces under Wellington helped hold the line and push back. The French army won battles, but the war kept returning, again and again. Napoleon could defeat kings, but could he defeat a people who would not accept the king he gave them? The Peninsular War drained men, time, attention, and confidence. His empire needed obedience, but his conquests created resentment. His system needed order, but his armies created rebellion. And while Spain burned through French power in the west, another problem was growing in the east: Russia. At first, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had tried to exist in the same European system, but the relationship was unstable. Russia did not want to live forever under Napoleon's economic rules. Napoleon could not accept a major power quietly slipping away from his system. So in 1812, Napoleon made the decision that would become the great shadow over his legend. He would invade Russia. This was not just another campaign, it was a gamble against distance itself. Napoleon gathered a massive army from across his empire and allied states. French soldiers marched with Poles, Germans, Italians, and others. It looked like the power of Europe moving east. But Russia was not like the battlefields Napoleon had mastered before. Russia was space. Russia was distance. Russia was roads that stretched farther and farther. Russia was an enemy that could retreat and still be dangerous. Napoleon wanted a decisive battle. He wanted the kind of moment he understood. Find the enemy, strike, win, negotiate. But the Russians did not give him the clean ending he wanted. Then came Moscow. To Napoleon, Moscow should have been the prize. A great city, a symbol, a place that would force the Tsar to talk. But when the French entered, the victory felt strangely empty. A place that would force the Tsar to talk. But when the French entered, the victory felt strangely empty. Moscow did not become the key to peace. It became a trap of expectation. Napoleon waited. He expected negotiation, but the message he wanted did not come. The city was damaged by fire, supplies were limited, winter was approaching. And now the emperor who had spent years moving faster than his enemies had to face a terrifying truth. He was far from home. Too far. The road back would be harder than the road in. The retreat from Russia became one of the most devastating moments in military history. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, disease, and constant pressure shattered the army. The same force that had entered Russia as a symbol of Napoleon's dominance came out broken. This was not just a military defeat. It was the moment Europe saw that Napoleon could bleed. And once Europe saw that, everything changed. Prussia rose. Austria shifted. Russia pushed west. Britain continued the war. The old enemies were no longer asking whether Napoleon could be stopped. They were asking how fast they could move before he recovered. But Napoleon was not finished. That is what makes the story so dramatic. Many rulers would have collapsed after Russia. Napoleon returned to France and built another army. Young recruits, remaining veterans, a desperate empire trying to survive. In 1813, the pressure grew. Coalition armies closed in. The fighting spread across Europe. The emperor who once decided the fate of kingdoms now had to defend the heart of his own power. By 1814, enemy forces entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated. The man who had crowned himself emperor was forced to give up the throne. He was sent to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean. For Europe's kings, the nightmare seemed over. The revolution had been contained. The emperor had fallen. The old monarchy was restored in France, and diplomats gathered in Vienna to rebuild the map of Europe. But then came the most unbelievable chapter of all. Napoleon came back. Imagine being one of Europe's rulers at that moment. You think the war is over. You think Napoleon is trapped on an island. You think the old order can finally breathe again. Then a message arrives. Napoleon has escaped Elba. Napoleon returns not as a memory, but as a living threat. This period became known as the 100 Days, and Europe did not hesitate. This time, the rulers understood the danger. They were not going to negotiate with Napoleon's return. They were going to end it. Napoleon knew he had one chance. The coalition armies were gathering. That is the real drama of Waterloo. It was not just a battle. It was a race against connection. And Europe did not hesitate. This time, the rulers understood the danger. They were not going to negotiate with Napoleon's return. They were going to end it. Napoleon knew he had one chance. The coalition armies were gathering, so he moved quickly into Belgium. His plan was classic Napoleon. Strike before the enemy is ready, separate the armies, defeat them one by one, force a political result before Europe can crush him. In front of him stood the Duke of Wellington and an allied army. Nearby was the Prussian army under Blücher. If Napoleon could break them apart, perhaps the dream could survive. If they came together, his empire would end. That is the real drama of Waterloo. It was not just a battle, it was a race against connection. Could Napoleon defeat Wellington before Blücher arrived? Could he win one last time before Europe closed the door? On June 18, 1815, the armies faced each other near Waterloo. The ground was wet from rain. The morning was slow. Time mattered. Every hour gave the Prussians a chance to come closer. Napoleon attacked. Wellington held. Again and again, French pressure struck the Allied line. But Wellington's army did not break. Behind the drama of the battlefield was a simple, terrifying countdown. If the Prussians arrived, Napoleon's chance would shrink. If Wellington fell first, Napoleon might survive. For hours, the battle balanced on the edge. Then the Prussians began to arrive. The battlefield changed. Napoleon was no longer fighting one army. He was fighting the united will of Europe. Near the end, Napoleon sent in the Imperial Guard. These were not ordinary troops in the imagination of France. They were the symbol of his power, the men associated with his greatest victories, the last reserve, the final card. If they broke Wellington's line, history might bend again. If they failed, the legend would collapse in front of everyone. They advanced. For a moment, the old fear returned. Napoleon's name still carried power. His guard still carried the memory of empire. But this time, the line did not break. The guard was stopped, and when the rumor spread that the guard was retreating, the psychological wall of Napoleon's army cracked. The emperor who had made Europe tremble now watched his final gamble dissolve. Waterloo was lost. Napoleon returned to Paris, but there was no miracle left. He abdicated again. This time, Europe would not send him to a nearby island. Elba had been too close, too small a prison for a man who could turn his name into an army. So he was sent far away, to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, the man who had almost ruled Europe would spend his final years surrounded not by armies and emperors, but by ocean. The question at the beginning was simple. How do you stop Napoleon? Europe's answer took more than one battle. It took coalitions. It took money. It took resistance in Spain. Napoleon was not defeated by one enemy. He was defeated by Europe itself. They showed that the French Revolution had not only destroyed a monarchy, it had unleashed a new kind of politics. Mass armies, national feeling, ideological war, modern administration. The idea that a ruler could rise not from ancient blood, but from talent, force, and opportunity. Napoleon spread laws, institutions, and reforms, but he also spread war on a scale Europe could never forget. He terrified kings because he proved they were not untouchable. He inspired soldiers because he proved a nobody could become an emperor. He exhausted nations because his dream had no natural stopping point. And in the end, the greatest mystery of Napoleon is this. Was he the child of the revolution? Or did he become the very kind of ruler the revolution was supposed to destroy? In 1804, he placed a crown on his head. By 1812, he had carried his empire too far into Russia. By 1815, he had one last chance at Waterloo. And after that day, Europe did not simply remove a man. It tried to build a system that would prevent another Napoleon from rising. The map was redrawn. The balance of power became the great obsession. The kings came back, but they came back afraid, because Napoleon had shown the modern world something unforgettable. A revolution could destroy a king, a soldier could become an emperor, and one man, for a few extraordinary years, could make an entire continent wonder whether history itself had chosen him. This was not just the story of Napoleon's rise and fall. It was the story of Europe discovering that the old world was gone, and the modern world had arrived through fire, ambition, and war. This was not just the story of Napoleon's rise and fall. It was the story of Europe discovering that the old world was gone, and the modern world had arrived through fire, ambition, and war.